Do you have a child or a loved one who is suffering from ADHD? And have you been asking yourself, I'm wondering what is really at the root or the cause of what's causing the ADHD? If so, then this video is for you. And in fact, I'm going to be addressing ADHD specifically over the next several videos. Hi, my name is Lisa Andy Garcia, and I am an integrative developmental and educational specialist, and my focus is helping you reverse the learning and behavior challenges that your child is experiencing. In this video, we are going to be looking at 4 specific and very different underlying factors that is behind what is causing ADHD. But first, I would like you to hit the subscribe button so you'll be the first to know when I post a new piece of content, and especially in this series as we are going to be building off of one from another. So if you're older than maybe 35, you have probably noticed that the rate of ADHD and other mental and physical disorders, for that matter, have skyrocketed in the last 20 years. And just that was just from 1997 to 2017, the rate almost doubled. And that's been, 6 years ago. So that alone should let you know that it's not genetic. Or it's not fully genetic. Okay, genes do have something to do with it, but there are other more important factors as well. And so I don't know if you have heard of the term epigenetics, but it means how your genes are expressing themselves, and it's determined by lifestyle and environmental factors. The genetics give us the predisposition to react to certain things and certain toxins. But if they're not in our environment, then those genes can't be expressed or switched on. Okay, so one example might be diabetes. My husband is from Mexico, and he remembers when he was young, nobody had diabetes, or even practically nobody had cancer. Everybody was thin, right? But it doesn't mean that they didn't have specific genes, but whatever was in the environment and the toxicity and all the things that play into causing a person to be diabetic wasn't really present then, and now it is present, and now it has become an epidemic. So when looking at the root causes of ADHD, we can pretty much sum it up by 4 things: inflammation in the brain, lack of nutrients in the brain, technology, and a lack of connectivity of the brain due to lack of movement. Okay, so we're going to first talk about inflammation in the brain. It's also called neuroinflammation. It's pretty much at the root of anything that's going wrong with the brain. Where there's neuroinflammation, you're going to see those types of symptoms, right? So if whatever part of the brain is inflamed, whatever the job was for that specific part, that's the symptom that you're going to see. So the question is where does the neuroinflammation come from, or how does it start? So mainly it starts from the gut. If you've been around in the last 10 years, you've been hearing a lot about the gut-brain connection. I have a 22-year-old moderate to severely autistic son. When he was back in 2003, that's when we were kind of starting this whole journey for ourselves. And we learned from his doctors about the gut-brain connection, but it was not mainstream. People just did not know about it. In fact, first time we heard about gluten, the first time that we heard about some things, it doesn't mean that people didn't know, but it wasn't widely known. So when the gut is inflamed, the blood-brain barrier is also inflamed. So the brain is surrounded by a protective barrier called the blood-brain barrier. And when one is inflamed, so is the other. They mirror each other. This is this gut-brain axis, and when there's an imbalance in the gut, it's called a dysbiosis. So if you imagine your grass or your lawn, you have, let's say your yard, you have grass and then you have weeds, right? And we're always trying to, we want to have more grass and less weeds. But when we stop paying attention to our lawn, or if we, do certain things, then the weeds will grow. Let's say we kill all the grass for whatever reason. Let's say we even choose to, we kill all the grass, but we're not going to just have dirt. Something's going to grow in its place, and that's going to be the weeds. The weeds are always kind of going to prevail. So what happens is when we've had antibiotics in our life, like for example, me, when I was a kid, I used to get an annual round of antibiotics for ear infections until I was about 9. Antibiotics kills all your bacteria. So we have a lot of good bacteria, and we have not so good bacteria, and we actually just want them to integrate and behave. We want those dandelions just to be few and far between, and the grass to be more prevalent. But the antibiotics will kill all the grass and allow all the weeds to grow. And also, we don't get enough bacteria sometimes through the natural birthing process. So let's say a child is born through cesarean. They didn't get to go through the birth canal and get kind of this inoculation of good bacteria at birth. And also when the baby is born, they kind of like, kind of gooey. They have that, I forgot what they call that coat that they have. But when you clean that off too fast, that in itself serves as another type of inoculation of good bacteria. So there's different reasons why our bacteria might be at different levels, and different people around the world have different microbiomes, different types of bacteria, just by what we eat and what's in our surroundings. And also, glyphosate is a huge problem with our gut. It is sprayed on pretty much all the grains and most of our food, especially like the wheat and the grains. And it is basically tearing up our gut lining, causing the leaky gut. And then we have gluten, which is another problem, because it is sprayed, but it's also GMO'd. Our body isn't able to digest it correctly, and gluten, for most people, at least the gluten that we're eating here, unless you're eating certain, like some of the ancient grains, or you're in Europe, but our gluten here in the United States is pretty much not really suited for us, and it's also tearing up our gut. And also gluten has peptides. So what happens is you have a protein, and there's a lot of different gluten proteins and proteins in wheat. It's not just one protein, but gluten is one of the proteins in wheat. And when you break them up into segments, so you have a pearl necklace, which is the whole protein, you break them up into chunks of pearls. Those are peptides, and each pearl represents an amino acid. Well, those peptides, when they go through the leaky gut, now that it's been destroyed with glyphosate and it's been destroyed, for whatever other pathogenic stuff that's going on, it gets into your blood, and the immune system is activated. And when that happens over time, some of those peptides look just like thyroid, looks just like cerebellum, which is in the brain, looks just like parts of the basal ganglia, and maybe even some other parts. And that's when your body will start to attack those issues. And also the cerebellum, there's the Purkinje cells in the cerebellum, and the gluten, has an affinity. They, like when you see, when a person is stopped for drunk driving, let's say, and they have to walk the straight line or put their finger on the nose, that they're actually testing the cerebellum, because that's what the cerebellum does best. And gluten can actually, it's called gluten ataxia, and you kind of can look drunk when you have too much gluten. That's some people. And in the basal ganglia also is another motor area. Your thyroid, of course, is in charge of everything. So that's kind of why gluten also is not very helpful. So bacteria also, so in your body, your bacteria creates waste. And the good bacteria creates waste, but it's good waste. It's things that it will do things in your body. And in fact, there are some compounds in your body that that you can't get from food, but you get from what your bacteria produces, and that's why you need good bacteria. And they excrete these chemicals that can either help or hurt us depending on the type of bacteria it is. And bad bacteria excrete LPS, which is called lipopolysaccharides, and these lipopolysaccharides are excitotoxins. They're or endotoxins, and which means that they're toxins made from within our body, and they will activate the microglia. So in our brain, we have immune cells too, and those are called microglia. And so these lipopolysaccharides, if they get in when they're in the bloodstream, they go through the blood-brain barrier, and then they activate the microglia. And specific chemicals and toxins are going to be explored in the next video, because I actually have a whole list of a bunch of different chemicals and toxins, but I want to save that for another video. Okay, number 2. So we talked about the gut and inflammation, neuroinflammation. Now let's talk about nutrients for a minute. One of the first books when I was doing my research and my son was diagnosed was called a book called Children with Starving Brains. And the title just kind of gives everything away. You almost don't even have to read the book. You just realize these children, no matter what cognitive problem, it's not just ADHD, but whatever that they have, they really are just starving of the nutrients that their brain needs to function. And one of the things too is that even if you are feeding your child a perfect diet, which we know that most of our children are picky, and we can go into that in another time, but we have picky eaters, so they're self-selecting. You usually self-select things that you are allergic to, but even if you were feeding them correctly, because of their gut issues, they are not necessarily digesting their proteins correctly. They are, at best, probably digesting them into peptides, not all the way down to the amino acid. So if you think about a Legos set, and let's say that's your food and you're eating it, that's your protein. You eat it, and you should be breaking all the Legos down to the individual pieces, and then your body will reconstruct those Legos into different little things, and for whatever your body needs. But if we are just kind of, so what are some of the reasons we're not digesting our protein? First of all, they eat too fast. And I'm going to include myself. I'm really bad at this. I was a teacher forever. We kind of get trained to just like shove food in our mouth, get work done, and move on. We don't have time to really sit and eat. So we eat too fast. We're not excreting getting those digestive juices or enzymes like in our saliva. We're not don't have enough time to signal our body to release the enzymes. Then oftentimes the hydrochloric acid is very low in our kids, so that's one thing to be looking at, is just adding some hydrochloric acid. And so enzymes, hydrochloric acid, habit of food eating are some of the reasons why we're not digesting our food appropriately. And so there is a product. If you're interested, you can just message me. There's a product that it's like in the form of a juice, or if your child's really little, it's the form of like a formula kind of type thing. And it's basically pure amino acids. So at least if your child is having trouble, making sure they're getting some type of really good source of amino acids, that is going to be very helpful. Then we have DHA. So, your omega-3s are really important, and DHA is really part for your brain. Your brain is made out of fat, so you need DHA. Lecithin is really good too. And then vitamins like vitamin D, K2, C, B12, and 6. Those are all, just that children are not getting their vitamins because either they're not eating meat, they're not eating the foods that have them, they're not digesting them. Our foods, the foods that they are eating, maybe because they're sprayed, maybe because they're GMO'd, whatever, they might not even have the same amount of vitamins and minerals that they once did anyway. And then that leads us into minerals. Minerals is hugely critically important. Your macro minerals are your big minerals, your calcium, magnesium, sorry, I don't know where my brain is. Calcium, magnesium, potassium, and sodium. So those are your macro minerals. Those are your big minerals. Like, so when you take calcium, you know, it's like a big capsule. And then you have trace minerals, and they're like, there's more than 100 trace minerals, and they're very tiny, but they're very important. So just putting some Himalayan salt inside a little bit of water, or some way of getting some trace minerals into the system, you're going to be hitting things like, you know, selenium and lithium and all of those really critical things that we might not think about, especially if we were programmed to avoid salt. Okay, so there's good salt and there's bad salt. Table salt is the not so good salt, but you can have like Celtic sea salt and Himalayan salt, and so there's some good salts. So being cognizant of minerals and the macro minerals and trace minerals, like the electrolytes are the macro minerals. Coconut water is a good source too. All right, so if you want to know more about the nourishing part of the brain, I have a book called Nourishing Your Brain, and so make sure you click that link in the description for my ebook. All right, so the next thing besides gut and toxins, we have this huge and rapid increase in technology. And technology, everybody might think there's this negative part of technology, but we might be thinking about from different perspective. So there is a social aspect that we hear a lot about, right? The social bullying or whatever. But the technology also has gives dopamine hits, and so there's this dopamine. So if you ever try to take your phone away from your teenager, they get angry with you, right? So that's a dopamine problem. Then it also is it's training people to not pay attention for long periods of time because everything is so fast that it's rewiring our brain to not be able to pay attention, which is very problematic, obviously, in ADHD. And then we have the EMF problem, so all the wireless and the EMF, that messes up with your cells and your DNA, okay? It messes up with the cell wall, the calcium ion channel, and your DNA, and so all the wireless part is it's causing a problem on a cellular level, and it's preventing kids from going outside and playing. In fact, it was so funny because last week I was at a conference. I had a booth. I was a vendor, and it was a natural health conference, and I was just talking to this guy, and I think he was 35, and he said that he was like the last generation of kids that went outside and played. And his sister, it was 4 years younger than him, and she was like, she had a completely different experience. By the time she was of age, kids weren't outside playing anymore. So that was kind of like, that's why in the very beginning of this video, I said if you're about over 35, because that was probably like the magic number of all of a sudden kids didn't know what it was like to go outside and play. But the technology is preventing kids from going outside and playing. And we're, I guess we'll move on to the next one, because play and movement is the number one way of how the brain grows. So, we're talking all this time about, like inflammation and all the things that kind of prevent the function of the brain, but the brain grows and develops from the babies and the infants through specific movements, right? So we know like crawling is really important, and there's the babies do rhythmical movements, and they do all these things to help train themselves how to learn on purpose. And right here we have the motor cortex, And when this part is stimulated, it actually starts to grow and connect and develop other parts of the brain. But when kids don't move, then not, the other parts of the brain aren't developed. And we can see that with kids who have cerebral palsy. If children who have cerebral palsy are not they can't move, right? Because they can't. Let's say they're severe cerebral palsy. We can see that the adjacent areas, they can be blind, and these other areas just don't develop. So baby children who are on technology are not playing because they're just stuck in on technology. But we also have kids who are stuck in car seats too long, or who for whatever reason aren't going outside. Now I have a younger son, he's 14, and when he was young, like 5, 6, 7, or even now, the reason he doesn't go outside and play, the reason that he never really went outside and played, except for when we were in a situation where for a few years where there was kids who went to the park and they actually did play, but it's because nobody else is outside. So even though he is restricted from his technology, like he's not allowed to be on it whenever he wants, he just doesn't go outside because there's nothing to do outside. Like he has nobody to play with, and so there's different reasons why kids are not playing and why they're not moving. But I want you to know that we're going to talk about it in a later video, but this movement, this lack of movement, and lack of very specific movements, such as crawling, such as rhythmical movements, such as walking outside barefoot and just climbing up a tree, and it affects them three-dimensionally. These children are staring at screens and they're looking at two-dimensional screens, and they're not outside experiencing a three-dimensional world. So it's affecting them on so many levels. So anyway, in the next video, we are going to talk more specifically about toxins, but just to remind ourselves, in this video, we were talking about the underlying factors around ADHD. So the inflammation, the lack of nutrition, the technology, and then the lack of movement. And if I had to really sum it up, those are the 4 big things that are contributing to why our kids have ADHD. So again, the next video we're going to talk more specifically about toxins.